Don't die, it's bad for your health.
You don't say. Hello fellow slaves of the IB and welcome to my first psychology video by myself. As stated in the introductory video, I'm going to be doing a series on the cognitive levels of analysis, which we're going to be shortening to CLA because cognitive levels of analysis is a mouthful and I don't really want to say it every time I have to say it. So CLA is what we're going with. To start with, I will be doing 3 videos on the general learning outcomes. Now, I'm aware that there are 4 general learning outcomes, but the first 2 are very similar and can be condensed into one video, which is what I'm going to be doing today. The general learning outcomes that will be combined in this video are outline the principles that define the CLA and explain how the principles of the CLA can be shown in research. The first principle of the CLA is that humans are information processors and that mental processes guide our behaviour. Cognitive psychologists want to discover the principles behind cognitive processes, and this principle, the first principle of the CLA, shows or suggests that there is a relationship between people's mental representation of the world and the way they perceive and think about the world. Psychologists see the mind as a complex information processing machine, kind of like a computer. The brain is your hardware in essence. Input enters the brain through bottom-up processing, which is basically processing that comes in through the sensory system. Then the information is processed through top-down processing, which means that the information is processed based on information that you already have from your previous knowledge, and then the output is your behaviour. Schemas are demonstrated within this principle. Schemas are defined as mental representations of knowledge. Schemas guide how we will interpret incoming information and therefore affect how we make sense of the world. Schemas influence cognition. They create expectations of what you think will happen in certain situations. If someone says rock concert, you already have schemas of what you think will be happening at the rock concert, so you already kind of know what to expect. The schema theory can largely explain reconstructive memory, and it can also explain stereotyping as well. One study that you can use for this principle is Darley and Gross, or Gross, I'm not entirely sure, but it's spelled Gross. So Darley and Gross, which as I'm going to call him, 1983. Participants were shown a video of a young girl playing in a poor environment, and then they were shown videos of a young girl playing in a wealthy environment. And then they were shown a video of the girl doing what could be seen as an IQ test. The participants were asked to judge the girl's future and her results on the IQ test that she was supposedly doing. All participants said that they thought the poor condition girl would do worse than the rich condition girl. This shows how humans process information based on very few salient points, and this can then lead to an overall picture which is not necessarily correct. The participants clearly had pre-existing schemas in their mind based on how money can influence your success in life, and this influenced their answers in the study. This in turn shows how the mental processing of how they interpret the information coming in through those schemas affected their output, their behaviour. The second principle of the CLA is that the mind can be studied scientifically. Cognitive psychologists believe that the mind can be studied scientifically by developing theories and by using a number of scientific research methods to create empirical evidence. Cognitive psychologists develop theories and cognitive models which are continuously revised and tested and discussed. Old models can be amended by new findings, or old models can be completely rejected based on new findings. In the past, cognitive psychologists have mostly focused on experimental methods because of this principle, and they believed that experimental methods were the most scientific method of studying the brain. However, experimental methods often lack ecological validity as they occur in unnatural situations. In the 1960s, Ulrich Nesser said that cognitive psychology had become very artificial, or too artificial. He said that researchers should not forget that our cognition cannot be isolated from our everyday experience. And now, cognitive psychologists often study cognition with experimental methods, but also in an everyday context with less scientific methods. In case you're wondering who Ulrich Nesser is an American-German psychologist. He was a member of the US National Academy of Sciences before he died in 2012, and he has often been referred to as the father of cognitive psychology. so you would hope that he knew what he was talking about. The second principle of the CLA can be demonstrated in Loftus and Palmer 1974. Loftus and Palmer were aiming to study the reliability of memory or reconstructive memory in relation to eyewitness testimony. He wanted to see whether leading or misleading questions could distort participants' memory. Participants were shown a video of a car crash. They were then asked several questions, including the leading question, which was supposedly hidden between these other questions so the participants couldn't tell which one it was. The leading question asked the participants what speed they thought the cars were going at. There were 5 conditions in this experiment. Some participants were asked how fast they thought the cars were going when they contacted. However, this verb changed and got more violent depending on which group was being asked. The verbs used were contacted, hit, bumped, collided, and smashed, obviously going from least to most violent. The more violent the word was, the higher the mean speed that the participants guessed the cars were travelling at for that condition. So contacted had the lowest overall mean speed guessed by all participants in that group, and smashed had the highest, and there was a 9-mile-an-hour difference between these two conditions, and you can look up what that is in kilometers if it really bothers you. There was a follow-up question asking participants whether or not they had seen broken glass in the video. 32% of participants who had been previously asked a question using the verb smashed said they had seen broken glass in the video. Compare this to participants from the hit condition, and only 14% said they saw broken glass. For a control condition, only 12% said they'd seen broken glass in the video. Because the experimental method was used in this study, there can be a clear cause and effect established, and it links to the principle because it shows how the mind can be studied scientifically. However, experimental methodology, as stated before, has been criticised for its lack of ecological validity, and for this study in particular, it has been criticised by other psychologists, Ewell and Cutshall, and they said that memory, when looking at a real-life situation, is more clear and is more reliable and is less easily distorted. The third and final principle defining the CLA is that cognitive processes are influenced by social and cultural factors. One of the first to say this was the British psychologist Bartlett. Now, if you've been studying psychology for a while, I should hope that you know this name. Bartlett also coined the term schema, so that's him. People remember things in terms of what makes sense to them, and therefore it makes sense that what makes sense to you would be influenced by your cultural norms and your previous experience in life. However, this is also why memory is subject to distortion. Bartlett himself was very interested in how cultural schemas could influence memory, and further research has shown, apart from Bartlett, that cognitive processes such as perception, memory, and thinking are influenced by social cultural factors. The study that you can use for this principle is Bartlett's 1932 War of the Ghosts study. In this study, Bartlett aimed to show that memory is reconstructive and that schemas influence recall. In this study, participants were asked to read through a story from the Native American culture twice. 15 minutes later, the participants were asked to recall the story from memory, and then after that they were asked to recall the study a few more times from memory whenever they could come into the laboratory. It seemed that the story was hard for people of a Western culture to remember properly, and there were several characteristic changes that seemed to change for everybody's story. So number 1, the story got shorter. Number 2, the story as a whole remained coherent no matter how distorted it became. And number 3, the story became more conventional for a Western culture which the participants were from. It retained only details that could be assimilated into the past cultural background and shared experience of the participants. The changes that occurred to the story that they were remembering shows how their remembering was influenced by their social and cultural factors, and therefore this links back to the principle. That's all 3 of the principles. I hope this video was helpful. I'll be doing 2 more videos about the general learning outcomes of the CLA, and then hopefully after that I will continue doing the rest of the points of the CLA that you should need to know before your exams. Bye! Yes, please.
She doesn't know how to work my camera.
Based on very the mind can be studied.
The National Association. He was a member of the U.S. National Association of the Academy. What is it?
The second principle of aiming to test reconstructive memory, and that schema. Like that. I'm gonna say that again.